When we think about what makes a country strong, we often think about things like infrastructure or big industries. But what if a nation's greatest asset is actually its people? Well, today we're going to dive deep into the Indian government's economic survey for 2025-26 to really understand how the country is investing in its citizens to power its future.
First things first, let's just get our heads around the sheer scale of this. 145 crore people. I mean, that's not just a number, right? It's this incredible opportunity, a massive demographic dividend that could fuel growth for decades. But it's also a huge challenge. How on earth do you make sure every single one of those people gets a real shot at reaching their full potential?
Well, the key to unlocking all that potential lies in building something economists call human capital. It's actually a pretty simple but really powerful idea. Investing in people and their education, their health, their skills is the most direct way to get both economic and social progress. It's about turning that massive population number into a productive, innovative, and frankly, resilient workforce.
So to really get to the bottom of this, we've broken our explainer down into 5 key parts. We're going to start with the main challenge, then we'll look at the absolute foundation, which is education. From there, we'll talk about well-being and skills, check out the real-world gains in social progress, and finally, look ahead to what an inclusive future might look like.
All right, let's kick things off with the central puzzle. How does India take this demographic dividend, this massive young population, and turn it into a genuine advantage for development? As you might guess, the answer really starts with education.
Now, this slide right here really gets to the heart of the issue. It shows the expected years of schooling for a child born in today. And you can see, while India is at 13 years, it's still trailing behind countries like China and Brazil, let alone developed economies like Germany. And look, this isn't just a numbers game. This gap, it represents lost potential. This is the core of the human capital challenge we're talking about.
So the big question is, how do you close a gap like that? Well, the strategy has to start with the absolute foundation, education. And we're not just talking about building more schools here. This is about a really fundamental shift in policy to shape a generation that's actually ready for the 21st century.
And this is the government's main response, the National Education Policy of 2020. You can see it's a massive overhaul. It's designed to completely transform the entire learning ecosystem, from the earliest years all the way up to higher education. The focus is really on things like flexibility, making sure everyone's included, and teaching real-world skills.
But here's the thing. Big policy goals often run into tough, real-world problems. This chart is so telling because it shows us exactly why so many teenagers are dropping out of school. Just look at the 2 biggest reasons. A whopping 44% leave to help support their families, and another 28% have to help with chores at home. So what this really tells us is that any effective education policy has to tackle these deep socioeconomic issues too.
And that brings us perfectly to our next section. Because human capital isn't just about what you learn in a classroom, right? It's about being healthy enough to contribute and having the actual practical skills to get a good job. You can think of these as the twin pillars of a truly productive workforce.
Now, on the health front, India's story is really interesting. It's kind of 2 stories at once. On one hand, you have these incredible successes, like a huge drop in maternal and child mortality. But on the other hand, there's a new challenge, what's called a double burden. Basically, the country is still fighting infectious diseases, while at the same time, lifestyle diseases like heart conditions and diabetes now cause more than half of all deaths.
Okay, now let's switch over to skills. And wow, this number is pretty staggering. 92% of adolescents haven't received any kind of formal skills training. This just highlights a massive disconnect between traditional schooling and what the modern job market actually needs. Think about that for a second. A whole generation is walking into the workforce without the specific tools they need to succeed. That can really limit what they can earn, and of course, it slows down the whole economy.
So, how do you even begin to bridge a gap that big? Well, the game plan seems to have 3 main parts. First, you have to bring practical vocational skills right into the schools. Second, you need to completely rethink apprenticeships for today's economy, creating real on-the-job training. And third, and this is probably the most important, you have to constantly make sure that the training you're providing is exactly what industries are looking for right now.
All right, so we've looked at the strategy, focus on education, health, and skills. But the big question is any of it actually working? So let's shift gears and look at the impact, at how these policies are translating into real results for people.
And this right here is a really powerful sign of progress. The slice of the population that's covered by social safety nets, things like pensions and insurance, has almost tripled in less than a decade. It's jumped from just 22% all the way up to over 64%. That's a massive expansion of the social safety net.
And behind that huge expansion is a real financial commitment. This chart shows that government spending on social services is now almost 8% of GDP. Now, I know these percentages can feel a bit abstract, but what they really represent is a sustained national investment in those core pillars of human capital we've been talking about: education and health.
This quote from the Economic Survey really gets to the philosophy behind all these numbers. The end goal isn't just about economic growth for its own sake, it's about inclusive development. It's about making sure that progress is built on a solid foundation of fairness, dignity, and empowerment for everyone, especially those who are most vulnerable.
And we can see that philosophy in action right here. Take the reform of the giant Rural Employment Program, MGNREGS. This new act is designed to shift the focus away from just providing temporary wages and toward creating lasting community assets, things like better roads or water conservation projects. It's really about improving accountability and making sure rural development lines up with India's long-term goal of becoming a developed nation.
So, all of this brings us to our final section. As we look toward the future, the survey makes it really clear that building human capital isn't just a job for the government. It's going to take a true partnership, a sense of shared responsibility that runs through all of society. You know, I think this might be one of the most powerful ideas in the whole report. Real development isn't something that's just handed down by government departments. It's the sum of millions of individual actions. It's the quiet habits, the personal discipline, the care we take in our work and in our communities. Progress is really built from the ground up. And so, that's where we'll end, with this question. The survey does a great job laying out the role of the government and the role of businesses. But in the end, it brings the focus right back to the individual. In a world full of distractions, how we choose to learn, how we approach our work, how we take care of ourselves and each other. These small, daily choices are what ultimately build a nation's future. So, what is the role of the citizen? That's a question for all of us to think about.